Hello everybody and welcome to Bash Course Quarantined European History. My name is Faith and today we are going to learn about artistic movements through history. Artistic movements are often overlooked in historical courses, but they are important to the definition of different ages, and a solid understanding of their developments and significance can help greatly with questions in document analysis on tests. Being familiar with these movements is important to both European and US history, so I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the major movements from the Renaissance to the 20th century. So the Renaissance. This, in the 15th and 16th centuries, is when Europe moved past all the grim medieval stuff and began doing a bunch of humanist art focused on the appreciation of human genius, as well as older Greco-Roman traditions. This first painting, I'm sure you know. It's the Mona Lisa, Da Vinci's classic humanist portrait. The second is Botticelli's Birth of Venus, a representation of the Greek myth. The Renaissance also had a huge impact on society, education, and culture, and also included the works of Michelangelo, Jan van Eyck, and Raphael. A movement that grew out of it was called Mannerism, from around 1520 to 1620, in which artists such as El Greco painted slightly stretched figures and vivid colors to break some of the mathematical rules and proportions of the Renaissance. Following Mannerism was the Baroque style of the late 16th to 18th centuries, which was a decidedly emotional and religious style in reaction to the careful measures of the Renaissance. It was closely tied to the Catholic Counter-Reformation. It also led to later developments in music, although that had expanded to include many Protestant artists. Its figures are dramatic and theatrical, and some of its most famous artists include Diego Velázquez, Rembrandt, Bernini, and Peter Paul Rubens. Works glorifying Louis XIV in France often also fall into this category. In 1715, a new style emerged called Rococo, which would last only until around 1750. A reaction against the dramatic late Baroque, it was a light-hearted, overly ornate style that influenced interior decoration as much as paintings such as this one, called The Swing, by Jean-Honoré Fragonard, and the inside of the Versailles Palace. This frivolous style was soon replaced, however, by the much more serious Neoclassicism, from 1750 to 1800. This was focused on a return to detail, logic, and classical styles, and evolved with the Enlightenment in Europe. The most famous practitioner of this style was Jacques-Louis David of France. This movement often focused on historical events, such as in David's Death of Marat in the French Revolution. American painters included Benjamin West, and this style, along with the Enlightenment, had a great influence on the Revolution, government, and higher culture in the United States during its formative years. However, soon people grew tired of the serious appraisals of events and cold intellect of the neoclassicists, and so Romanticism appeared, focusing on human emotion, imagination, and sentiment. This was also an intellectual and musical movement, think Chopin and Wagner, focusing on an individual genius, etc. Painters liked to focus on wild landscapes, often tied to nationalistic sentiments toward their countries, and emotional portraits. This included paintings like British J.M.W. Turner's Seascapes, and French Eugène Delacroix's Liberties Leading the People, which depicted the emotional and patriotic times of the French Revolution of 1830. This is the same revolution depicted in Romantic writer Victor Hugo's Les Misérables. Romanticism persisted throughout the social upheaval of the 1848 revolutions in Europe and the War of 1812 and Mexican-American War in the U.S. American Romantic artists include Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, William S. Mount, and George Caleb Bingham. These artists were inspired by Romantic movements at the time, as well as the contemporary Transcendentalist movement. In America, Romanticism led to the first American artistic movement, the Hudson River School, which focused on the romantic nature of the northeastern landscapes and led to a more national character in that country. During this time, there was also the Pre-Raphaelite movement in northern England, which was an imitation of medieval style, but still followed Romantic rejection of mathematical painting styles. This was heavily associated with the new rich of the Industrial Revolution. Another movement that arose around the mid-19th century was Realism, one that focused on the experiences and daily lives of workers, peasants, and others. This was a reaction to the emotion of the Romantic movement. It was also a movement in literature with the writings of Honoré de Balzac and Émile Zola, the artistic side featuring painters such as Jean Courbet, Jean-François Millet, and early Edouard Manet, who would go on to be a key figure in another movement. Impressionism followed from 1850 to 1880 and was a transitional movement from realist to modern art. It began the modernist era, which would last until well into the 20th century. Named for Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, but dedicated to the works of Edouard Manet, it was devoted to recording the more general impression of light and color on surfaces. This meant broken brushstrokes and color patches that were used to give a more unpolished look. This movement included the Europeans Camille Pissarro, Auguste Rodin, Alfred Sisley, and Auguste Renoir. In America, Winslow Homer bridged the gap between realism and impressionism, and then artists such as Marie Cassatt and Childe Hassam, and sometimes John Singer Sargent, brought impressionism into the culture during the loose times of the Gilded Age and laissez-faire governments leaving American society to its own ruin. Around this time, the invention of the camera led to art through photography as well. Following, but still much inspired by Impressionism, was PostImpressionism, where European artists refocused on subject matter more than simply on light and color from 1885 to 1905. As they tired of the limits of Impressionism, artists moved in many different directions, making this term an umbrella that covers many styles. Paul Cézanne was an early post-impressionist who pushed Impressionism into a more solid classical style, as well as Georges Seurat, who practiced pointillism. Other post-impressionists, however, pushed the movement further into the impressionist idea. Paul Gauguin used flattened shapes, dark lines, and bright colors to try to find primitive faith and spirituality, as imperialism and the idea of the white man's burden were drawing to a close. His sub-movement was called synthetism or symbolism. Vincent van Gogh, another post-impressionist, was more focused on the expression of emotion, and so pushed more into the interaction of color and brushstrokes for that effect. His emphasis on emotion would also cross over a bit into the next movement, Expressionism. Expressionism, from the closing years of the 1800s until the 1920s, was a movement focused on emotion and its expression through the distortion and hyperbolic use of color, shape, and texture. Some of Van Gogh's later works are considered expressionist, as well as Edvard Munch's The Scream, and the work of André Derain. Derain and another painter, Henri Matisse, founded a sub-movement called Fauvism, which focused on pure paint and colors without the rules of composition, but only lasted for a few years in the first decade of the new century. Another sub-movement called Futurism arose in Italy in 1909, concerned with the representation of the motion of the machine age. This was not as glamorous following World War I, but this movement eventually came to be liked by Mussolini's fascists in the 1920s. During the same time, American art was more focused on realism, with painters such as Edward Hopper depicting daily life in the 1920s and revealing the disillusionment of the American people after World War I. While Expressionism was in full force, another movement was happening simultaneously, Cubism. Cubism was much more of a reaction against Impressionism in the early 20th century. Cubism sought to present the subject matter in novel and challenging ways, instead of focusing on its surface appearance. It tried to highlight the subject's idea. Pioneered by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque near the end of the first decade of the 20th century, Cubism was an influential movement until the mid-1920s. Works such as Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon or Georges Braque's House at L'Estaque are good examples. In America, artists such as Charles Sheeler depicted urban settings in Cubist style, while Stuart Davis depicted objects of daily life in the 20s and 30s. During the First World War, a group of artists in Zurich in 1916 founded a movement called Dada. In opposition to the total destruction of the war around them, these artists, such as Marcel Duchamp and Jean Arp, focused on illogic, luck, and anything silly, nonsensical, or absurd. Their nihilistic tendencies extended also to writing and a lifestyle beyond just art. This established a base for the later Surrealist movement. From the late 20s to early 30s, there was also an influential Dutch movement called De Stijl, or Neoclassicism, which introduced modern and abstract art. Its key figure was Piet Mondrian. This type of modernism was followed up in America by artists like Georgia O'Keeffe, Ellie Nadelman, and Marston Hartley. After Expressionism, Surrealism became the main movement in Europe and America from the mid-1920s to around 1945. Looking to represent the subconscious and influenced by Sigmund Freud, this art form was the main one during the Depression of the 30s. Improvised versions of Surrealism were often collages such as Max Ernst or Jean Arp's. However, there were also depictions of dreamscapes and more finished works like Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory and René Magritte's The Lovers, and Ceci n'est pas une pipe. In America, artists like Alexander Calder used Surrealism as an escape from the grim realities of war and depression. More of an architectural style, Art Deco was common in the 1930s and in 1940s posters for World War II. It is sometimes mentioned on a certain exam, however, so it is included here. One American Art Deco artist was Tamara de Lempicka. In the 1940s and 50s, an American art movement developed, mainly in New York, as a post-World War II reaction to the conformity and consumerism in American culture. Called abstract expressionism, it took the expression of emotions to large canvases and abstract subject matters. Painters like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Helen Frankenthaler, and others were leaders in this style. This movement descended from the European abstract artist Vasily Kandinsky of earlier times. At its height in the 1980s, we also have Neo-Expressionism, also called trans-avant-garde. This is regarded as the beginning of postmodernist styles. Seeking to oppose the minimalist work of the 60s and 70s abstractedness, these artists took traditional forms but expressed them in visceral, sometimes violent ways. This art was often seen as a reaction to the conservatism of modern consumerist societies. Artists such as American Jean-Michel Basquiat and German Marcus Lüpertz represented this movement, as well as British Francis Bacon. In the modern age of consumerist and global culture, we also had the development of pop art, which was more closely linked to advertising than ever before, with artists such as American Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, and Keith Haring, as well as others such as Scottish Edoardo Paolozzi. Art played a significant role in global consuming culture. Well, that's all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed your overview of major artistic movements through time, and good luck on either history exam. Thank you for watching Bash Course Quarantined, and we'll see you next time. The Bash Course Quarantine team is Sandro Ansari, Sam Mencimer, Eamon Cole, Pasha Ishaq, Sarah Orozco, and myself. Please put any questions you may have in the comments below, and we'll do our best to answer them or get Dr. Seiler to. Thank you for watching Bash Course, and as they say in my hometown, oh my EOSH.